Hello and welcome to Prometheus Chats. I'm your host, Damion, and today I'm excited to have with me a new friend, Christian Ortiz. We met on LinkedIn and we've chatted a bunch, and I've seen well, not all of his work, but I've seen a lot of his work and what he's doing. And it's, I, I think it's amazing. I think it's really great. And I wanted to make sure that I took this time to introduce Christian to our followers, and you can hear his story because it touches on a lot of the things that we talk about on this podcast, a lot of the things that my company stands for. And so I think the way that Christian has integrated his beliefs, his values, and his personal life into the work that he does and to use them very seamlessly is not only admirable, but it's something that I would shoot for. And so I'm going to stop talking and let Christian introduce himself. Thanks for being on the podcast, Christian.
Damien, thank you so much for having me. It's truly a pleasure.
I think before we jump too far into it, let's tell people a little bit about your company. What do you do? Name, all that fun stuff, and then we'll get into the nitty gritty.
Absolutely. So I am the CEO and founder of Mod Atlas Media. I'm currently residing in Denver, Colorado. I started my business in Columbus, Georgia, south of Atlanta, back in 2019. So I'm a social media marketing company just dedicated to basically changing the face of entrepreneurship and corporate structure and the culture and kind of I'm trying to be the face of bringing corporate culture up to the times, especially with equity, diversity, and inclusion and the realities that we face in this new workforce. But I'm also a creator. I'm a digital creator. I'm an artist, photographer, musician. I do so much. So as a solo entrepreneur, I take all that on by myself. And for the larger companies that I've represented that I've worked with, I've hired individual contributors to kind of take on that work as well. So, but for the most part, it's me driving the ship.
Nice. And you said you started in 2019. What was the impetus for starting Mod Atlas? Was it, just perfect timing? Was there a catalyst that made it a sudden, like, I'm changing careers or?
Yeah, it was a little bit of all of that. I built the mod brand back in whew, 2008, 2009 as my band started. I had a band called Modesters, have it even tattooed on my arm,
Oh,
like the
nice.
MR. Um, yeah, it was a reminder, that I wanted to start something that was bigger than myself, and I didn't know what it looked like. I came from a very destructive past. My childhood was very chaotic, and as many inner city kids could understand growing up in the 80s and 90s, it was just the reality. And I was fortunate enough to be guided towards a path where I understood business, entrepreneurship, life, and self teaching my ways and learning the ropes as 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 that all happens. Over the years, I developed Modtography, which was my photography company, all self
Mhm.
taught as well. And then, but I was always working and off and on in the restaurant industry, corporate. I was in so many different industries for over 20 years, so I had an understanding of how corporate structure also worked as well. And in 2015, I started working for one of the largest credit card processing companies in the world down south. Can't use their name, but I was there for about 5 years. Moved up so quickly and learned the corporate world so quickly, and understood what power dynamics look like, and also understood what corporate drama looked like. And I had a hyper focus on mental health because mine was declining and my coworkers were
Mhm.
declining. And so it opened my eyes to so many things to the point where I was basically funneled into a corner at one position with, unfortunately, with the leadership that I had that made me actually it gave me a choice, right? It said, do I leave the corporate world and start something on my own? And what does that look like? And take that leap that we all as entrepreneurs know that fear and or do I just stick it out and then do I just stay miserable in this work environment? And so I chose the latter, and I immediately quit when I realized that it was a dead end for me, right? And that I knew my worth. I knew that I was capable of doing such bigger my mission was bigger than what it was just working for this corporation. And so the way it all kind of awkwardly, I guess by the grace of the universe, the way it worked out was that I've been in this space for media for over 20 years doing photography, media, audio. You know, I was all in this space, especially in social
Hmm.
media, right? I was raised by two older brothers who were Gen Xers and my mom who was a boomer. And so I I I grew up in this generation before technology. And then I also had kids and they blossomed into technology. And I was young enough to also understand the growth and to see how it impacted society. So I was highly entrenched into pop culture and highly entrenched into technology, and I got to understand at a young age where that was going to take us. And so I think having all of that as an advantage allowed me to comfortably say, you know what, I'm going to leave this company and I'm going to start my business and I'm going to do it in media. I don't know what it's going to look like. I'm going to learn along the way. It's going to be scary. But within the first 2 weeks, I had seven
Oh, wow.
clients. And after the first month, I had 15 clients and I was just, doing their Instagrams and their
Hmm.
Facebooks and social media and building their brand. And I had already built up kind of a popularity within myself. And then it just started growing from there. I started doing social media marketing campaigns for car companies. I worked with Disney, Tap Shoes in New York. I mean, I've hit Fortune 500 companies. I mean, it's taxing, but it's so rewarding and it's a constant learning lesson. And so this is where we are today.
That's amazing. I think you bring up a really good point that I don't know gets discussed enough is that transition, how there's this moment, oh crap, what am I doing? Am I gonna do this? Am I not? And everyone has a different way of overcoming that moment. For you,
Absolutely.
what was it that really helped you make that leap from, oh crap, this sucks, but what's on the other side, I don't know what that is.
Yeah, that's a really good question because I always take myself back to that. I do a lot of self-reflection as much as possible. And I always go back to that moment because I remember, I mean, we're talking I was top of the chain in a corporate business, great benefits, good pay, all my bills were paid, but the corporate structure was so
Mhm.
toxic, right? Where it wasn't worth it to me. And so when I made the conscious decision, I actually I spoke to my HR partner and I said, I need to take a day to really sit back and assess the situation and see where I'm at personally and try to figure this out. The next day that I woke up, I got out of bed and my entire body, I was going to get up to get ready to go to work to this corporate job, and my entire body shut down, almost like saying, hey, what are you
Mhm.
doing? Like, come back to bed. Like, it's cool. And it was in pain and I was so stressed out. And I said, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? Like, I'd rather wake up and just
Mhm.
figure it out like I've done the rest of my life, my whole life, and then we'll figure it out as we go. And I called my HR partner and I said, this isn't going to work out. I'm going to start, my own business and move forward from here. Appreciate everything, but it's not worth it for me. And 3 days later, I got my business license as a solo proprietor for my business.
Wow, I mean, it's interesting. So one of the things for me that really helped, to your point, you were like, your whole body shut down. I remember waking up and every morning I would get there's this knot in my stomach, right? And it wasn't like
Mm,
it was a bad job. It's not like I wasn't making good money. But I remember at the last company I worked for, I at the time my business partner and I we'd worked together at 4 startups together. And this last one we worked for, I started off consulting. So it was one of my clients. And then the project actually grew and started to become really interesting. And I decided, okay, you know what? I'm going to keep my business, but I will work for you full time and then just manage a few clients on the side. And I did. And it was great until the company got sold. And that new company was incredibly toxic. I mean, it was bad. And
yeah.
I remember
Mm,
thinking, you know what? I've done this before. I can do bad all by myself. I don't need help. Right. So, um,
yes,
and I know my
absolutely.
business partner was really nervous because he'd never done that before. And so the two of us were talking, and I told him it might suck. Like, I had just bought a house and there was all, and go, but you know what? I've had nothing before. I've been poor before,
Mhm,
and it wasn't that bad. Like,
mhm.
it wasn't great, but like, I was okay. I could do that again. Like,
That's right.
and so I talked to my wife same thing. And she was super supportive. Like, you have to get out of there. It's better for us to be sane and and
Yes.
not making a lot of money than to be miserable and just holding on to a paycheck. And so
I couldn't agree
fortunately
more.
for me, what made it a little bit easier was the company decided, hey, you guys did a great job. You built this company so big and you're doing wonderful. We're going to fire you. Bye. And so
Yeah.
that made it, luckily, I hadn't completely gotten rid of all my clients. So I wasn't, just out. But that was
Yeah.
I can't go back to this sort of thing anymore because
Absolutely.
every couple of years, someone else gets to decide your fate for you. You don't get to really influence the culture the way you would want to. I didn't want to commute and miss out on my son growing up. And then the pandemic hit, which was kind of a mixed blessing, right? You got to spend all this time at home with family and
Absolutely.
people were really understanding. And suddenly it felt like for a moment there was this brief, let's come together, kumbaya. Oh, wait, and we just kept going from there. But it was really before that, even it was the realization of this is not good for me. I can feel the dread
Yeah.
and there's something not connected. And I can either keep just dealing with it, fighting it, or not. Just burn the ships and figure it out. And
Absolutely.
so, yeah.
Yeah. And then you swim
Yeah.
along the way. Yeah. But there's such a what I've come to find with all of that is that there's so much power in that, and it teaches you so many things. It teaches you that we are not only fragile, it teaches you that we're also vulnerable, but it also teaches you how strong we really are when we have
Hmm.
to be, right? So it's that perfect balance of life that just it hits you right in the face. And I always say you're given a choice in everything. Everything's a choice. You get to choose of what direction you want to take it with. And so, you know, it is it is interesting also going back to what you said about COVID, when I started it was October 17th, 2019. COVID hit globally just a few
Hmm.
months later. So everybody was freaking out, realizing that, oh my gosh, I have to start transforming everything
Yep.
online. And that was my forte. So everybody was blowing me up. They were like, you do this? And I'm like, yes. And so thankfully, right, it's that silver lining within chaos that I was just like, oh my gosh, like what a heck of a choice to make
Hmm.
uh when you're facing something this massive, right? And so, yeah, I think the entrepreneurs like us who were spawned out of a pandemic were at a greater advantage than anybody who was in a corporate setting,
And I think the
unfortunately.
great thing for what we did, Prometheus, was all of the things that we'd been telling people about, not just digital transformation, but how to be more successful and making sure that you're being thoughtful in how your strategy is coming up. It's not because this feels good, I'm going to do it, right? And you're paying attention to who's your audience, who are you really talking to, versus this sounds good. Ooh, that's
Mhm.
creative, right? It can be really creative, but if it's not speaking to the people you want, then it's not doing you any good. All of those things, suddenly people cared about them during COVID and it became visible. And so, to
That's
your
right.
point, we really started to get a lot of attention and visibility, which they'd been things we'd been doing for the last 10, 12 years and trying to push, and they're just ignored until we had that impetus. And so as an entrepreneur, I mean, I was listening to a podcast the other day and they talked about idea of being in flow state when you're in the zone, and how in order for that to happen, it's not a singular step that happens. The first part of getting there is you have to have struggle. The first part, there has to be some challenge, and then you release that challenge and focus on doing something. And in that focus, after you've let go of the fact that, oh my God, there's a problem, you're like, okay, there's a problem. What do I do to fix it? Then you start to get into that, whether it be athletics or it be life. It's the same thing. And I think that happened for that moment, which was I'm still glad that it happened because I think you can see how it changed business going forward.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a true testament to your will, especially if you're in the entrepreneur space of how do you deal with adversity, right? Like that, we could throw out buzzwords all day long, but adversity to me is one of those things that's so real because life is always going to happen. And you have to figure out, okay, how do I move forward?
Mhm.
Right. And to me, I think that's what identifies the most successful entrepreneurs is for an entrepreneur to be able to look at any problem and say, yeah, this sucks. This is gonna hurt. This is gonna look crazy. This is gonna be scary, but we're gonna figure it out. And then we figure out ways to move forward.
Yep.
Right. It's just awesome. It's an awesome thing to
I
witness.
completely agree. Since we've touched on COVID and we were talking about that 2020 era, that was a very impactful year for a whole lot of stuff, especially when it comes to just cultural issues and equity and all of those things that really were brought to the forefront during that time period. And mostly because you had a captive audience, people couldn't go anywhere, so they had to see it. Uh, And in that time, suddenly a lot of people were talking about things that were before for. Let's talk about race. Let's talk about equity. Let's talk about what inclusion really means. Let's talk about tokenism. Is it okay now? I mean, and I'll be totally transparent. When I was in my corporate career, especially at studios or working in marketing, one of the things that I wouldn't do is I refused to work or have a title that said diversity, multicultural, anything like that, because what it did is pigeonholed you. Oh, you must not be a real marketer, right? You don't really know how to do blah, blah, blah. Or you can only do these diversity jobs. And
Mhm.
you were never going to become the head of the company doing that. For example, you'd be, oh, well, we'll have like a VP of multiculturalism or whatever we're calling it this day. And so, and even talking about it was something that I wouldn't do, not because I talk about it with people I knew and we would do things and I was, on every committee I could be and I was making sure that I was active and doing things, but it wasn't something that I was publicly espousing because again, there's that same stigma, right? Like, oh, you're one of those, one of the rebellious types. And it wasn't even a fear thing. It was more me being subversive to the system, right? Knowing how to short circuit to
Absolutely.
get what I needed to get done within the confines of what existed. But then 2020 just blew all that out of the water.
Yeah. And I couldn't agree with you more because as people of color who have worked in corporate structures, that's exactly what happens, right? I always say the reason why today we have an overflow and an influx of EDI culture or DEI culture, however you want to frame it, is because we as a nation just have failed to do the bare minimum to address these any of it. Right. And so the conversation is so new and is so fragile. And I remember the I can tell you exactly when it happened because me living in social media space, TikTok was
Hmm.
the when when the pandemic hit, everybody was on
Hmm.
TikTok. And what happens is when individuals start learning the app and they're coming face to face with racism and topics of race and they felt inclined to take that opportunity to say, "Oh, I can use this platform to educate the
Hmm.
world on things that we've never spoken about." And it completely, almost overnight, shifted everything to where these talks literally within a year became global, right? And COVID absolutely brought everything to the forefront in terms of even not only Black Lives Matter, which was absolutely unbelievably important,
Hmm.
AAPI, hate. And I got to see all of it. And what it was interesting to me is that it reminded me of the period right after 9/11 when
Oh
I
yeah.
was in Georgia, but all my family was in New York. And you got to see how America just expressed its Islamophobia and all of its racism, even in the time when we were supposed to be a nation of all togetherness, right? And it's these tragedies that kind of bring this out. And I think what the point that I'm trying to get to is that because of all of that, I feel like that was, for me at least, it was the opportunity that I took that I said, okay, now it's being talked about. Now people are listening. Now it's the time to bring this to the forefront. And that's what I've done with Mod Atlas is I put EDI at the forefront of my entire business because I don't want there to be any, I don't want anybody to even think that I have some type of, ideals that just don't match with my morals, you know? And so the minute that you get onto my content, you're either gonna rock with it or you're just gonna keep scrolling because it's not for you, right? And I'm okay
And
with
that's
that.
actually probably one of the biggest learning or one of the biggest lessons I think someone can learn. And I remember when I first came across that feeling of, wait a minute, not everyone's going to like what I have to say. Not everyone's going to like what I do or agree with me. And that's okay. Being okay with it and not the I need you to like me. I want you to be on my side. And it's you realize that what ends up happening is you
Absolutely.
save yourself a lot of heartache, even for clients, right? Because clients who don't like that don't come to work with you. And a lot of those friction points that you would have otherwise with those clients who are doing things that are against your morals and you're trying to change or trying to get them to do whatever, or you're like, I can't do this. And you don't have that anymore because you set the tone from the beginning about what your boundaries are, what your values are, what you're willing to do, not willing to do, what you believe in. So you actually, it's a nice way
Absolutely.
of culling the herd, right? We only want this group, and I think for a lot of new entrepreneurs, that might be a hard question to or a hard thing to wrestle with because you want everything. You want just to get that money and that business. Did you at all come across that early in in your company? Because it sounds like you got business pretty quickly, but then as you were growing, did you ever find that you had some clients in there and you were like, I'm gonna have to fire them because I have something that just doesn't agree.
Yeah, and I've actually had this conversation with them already. So if they stumble upon this podcast, they're gonna know who they are. The first 5 clients of mine, I started it in the South, and a lot of people don't recognize I've spent 25 years in the South, and I discovered racism personally in the South, right? So I know the impacts that it had on me. I know the way it makes people feel. I know how real it is in this nation because it was in the hub right around the corner
Hmm.
from me, And so as a business owner, yeah, when you're in that moment, you're a starting entrepreneur, the first thing you say is, I gotta make that bread. I gotta make that
Hmm.
money. So whoever comes is fine. Right. And then as you start working with them, they start showing you who they really are. And you're like, oh, but for me, it was almost an immediate reaction to say, I got into business so I didn't work with individuals like this. So what do I have to do? Right. It took a lot of self reflection and immediate attention to what my true purpose and mission was. Right. Yes, I need money and absolutely I need to survive, but I've also been
Hmm.
homeless. Right. So I know what it's like to have nothing. And I was always okay. Right. And so I know a lot of people don't have that life experience. So I understand the hesitancy and I understand that for the majority of people in America, they will never know what that's like. And I don't wish that on my worst enemy. But the beautiful part that I took with me in overcoming those challenges was to understand that having everything doesn't translate into financial
Hmm.
gain, right? It's about emotional. How am I complete as a person? What am I actually happy with? It changes the game for the whole thing. And so, a lot of the advice that I try to give to my starting entrepreneurs in this realm is to say, if you're all about the money, that's going to be very prevalent to anybody who you're trying to do business with. And it's going to actually reduce the purpose and your what you're trying to accomplish with them, right? Like if you're in it for the money, people are going to tell. And then it's going to be kind of a turnoff sometimes, right? Because it's all
Hmm.
about the dollar. But if you're able to say the money's going to come regardless, and I'm just going to keep doing me and I'm going to do it the right way, then the money's going to always be there. Period. And it's also a component of that taking the leap as an entrepreneur, right? It's the same fear that comes up when you are trying to develop that mindset. If I quit my comfortable job and I try to do this on my own, it's going to be scary. I don't know what I'm going to be doing. It's the same thing to saying, if I put money on the side and put my mission in the forefront, then the money's going to come automatically. Those are things that are developed just by
Hmm.
doing. Right? I could tell you all day long, but unless you truly do that, then it's like skydiving. And for all my skydivers out there, you look at the door and you want to pee yourself. And then once you jump, you realize that at the end of that fall is just
Yeah.
freedom and it's safety. And it's a beautiful, scary. nauseating experience that I recommend everybody
I
try.
did, and it was all of those things.
Yeah. It's an emotional roller coaster.
But I think that's really important, and it touches on something that we talked about before we started the podcast, which is the idea that your personal life, your personal values, all of that stuff comes with you to work, whether you admit it or not. Work is a microcosm of the society at large. Your thoughts, your beliefs don't disappear when you walk in the door at work. So the fact that for so long the idea of professionalism was ignore all of that. It doesn't work. When you're here, we're all the same. And it's not true. That's not really how it works. And
That's right.
the now the movement to put that first in forefront, the idea of I, it's such a buzzy term now, but bring your authentic self to work. But in essence, it's just saying stop with the pretense, just be who you are. We're gonna find out anyway, and let's just lead with
Yeah,
that, and then we can know where we stand and work together more effectively versus spending all this time pretending and fighting something. Um, and it's I
absolutely.
think you've been able to do an amazing job, even on a place like LinkedIn, where some people are like, "This is not the you get that this is not the place for that kind of conversation," right? And you're
Every
like, "It is
day.
though. This is happening at work, so this is why we should be having these conversations here." And I really love how you've taken it to like, oye, mira, we're gonna do blah blah blah, or let's talk about blah blah blah. And you even just so simple as an image that breaks down what is unconscious bias or something just very basic. And you do it within the confines or the context of what your work is. It's always graphically designed, it's always very culturally relevant. And it all has a taste of something that's you, very you, right? And without even having met you in person,
Mhm.
like I knew that this was Christian. And I'd see it, and without ever reading a word, I knew it came from you. I knew whose post it was. Was that something that you worked your way up to when you started your company, at least being more visible on like LinkedIn or how you're posting on social? Or was it something that you started out of the gate and went right into it?
No, it took me a while, honestly. It was interesting because, as we start our businesses, we really don't know. I'm going to take that back. You either know where you're going to go or you don't, right? And so there's no
Mm,
real middle ground. I was definitely on the side where I had no idea where I wanted to take this. For the last 20 years, I had built a bit of a following, surprisingly, on Facebook, on Twitter, with my music and photography. So I knew how the workings of social media had such an impact, right? I knew how to speak to people and different audiences on social media. I don't remember when exactly it was that it actually clicked with me. I think it was probably sometime last year where I saw an older interview with Oprah that I had forgotten about, where she said, people who know exactly where they want to be will get exactly to where they have to go. And so it's like, yeah, that makes
mhm,
perfect sense. Like if I know where I'm going, it doesn't matter how I'm going to get there. So I made a conscious decision at some point where the Oye Mira brand was to get people's attention to say, hey, listen, we need to talk about this. Right. And so the way that it made sense to me was to do that, was to create content through my art, my digital creation, my graphic design, so that it can show people that, I've always been an educator at heart, but I've always hated the school system because at an early age, I recognized what we weren't really
mhm,
being taught and like the challenges the students get. And it's just been a whole cluster. But the ability to educate has always been at the forefront of my business as well. Right. So as a consultant, you can relate to this. There's a passion that you have to have in our space where if we don't care about teaching you how to do something, then what are we even here
mhm,
for, right? So having the educational piece, I was able to incorporate that in there. And going back to what we just talked about just a few minutes ago, I had to immediately adapt this idea that my lovely lady always tells me. She goes, honey, the people that are gonna follow you are gonna follow you. The people who don't, they're not your people, right? They're not gonna be there. And when she said it in a way that it just resonated with me almost instantaneously, where it was so easy for me to just make that shift to say, yeah, you're right. Like, if you're going to like me, you're going to like me. And if you don't, you're not. And when I got on TikTok and I started using that methodology in creating my content, I mean, I built 2 accounts to up to 60,000 followers in like 3 months. And so I recognize that people really do want to hear this information, and they follow, and they really engage. And so yeah, and so somewhere along the way I was like, I can do this on LinkedIn, because I've been shut down on LinkedIn hundreds of times, but people were like, "Why are you posting
Mhm.
this here? This isn't what we talk about." And I'm like, "Oh, this is absolutely what we're gonna do today." And if you know, and if and I'm very respectful, so it's not like, I understand, like, this conversation is very not easy to have, right? With people, especially people not of color. But then, when you're able to explain things that make sense to individuals who find themselves in corporate America, who deal with microaggressions, and they can understand how racism exists in every facet of our society, it becomes easier over time. It not only becomes normalized, but it becomes easier for individuals to say, "Oh, Christian's posting this again. What's he talking about?" And it makes it almost easier for you to digest information over time. And so this is a long game for me, because I don't expect to just post something and it just be like, aha, I get it. Right. So the more we normalize these conversations, the more we educate, the more we continue spreading this messages. I mean, I can't tell you how much my following on LinkedIn has substantially grown for individuals like us who get it, who want to talk about it, but who are afraid because they get shut down all the time, or maybe they don't know how. So I use it as an opportunity to really propel that aspect of not only Mod Atlas, but yeah, about my values as a person as well. I think it's extremely important, especially in today's
Oh,
society.
no, I couldn't agree more, and it's always, I think, refreshing. People may not always say it, but it's refreshing when they see someone who can express those thoughts, those feelings, those things that they're thinking, or even answering the questions that they're ashamed to ask. Because if so many times it's, well, should I ask that? I don't really know. And you don't want to look like the dumb guy. You don't want to look like the one who's just insensitive.
Of
But then it's
course.
something that, without knowing, that ignorance that you have, it lends itself to friction and chaos. And when you proactively address, because we all know it's out there, but when you proactively address it and don't keep it hidden under the rug, or when you do like you've done, hey, I'm a safe space if you want to come here. Um, that makes a big difference, right? And it's not easy to do, and not everyone, that's not everyone's gift. It's not everyone's strong suit, right?
For
It's a
sure.
it's a very special
For
skill
sure.
set. But for those who do have that ability, for those who are in that place, I think it's a an invaluable resource that we have to take. And a lot of times we don't have these conversations because people are afraid. They're afraid they're going to be judged. They're afraid that someone's going to think badly of them. And during the pandemic, we created this short run podcast for that very reason, called Professional Confessions, where people would call us, send emails, or tell us stories about discrimination or issues of diversity that they experienced at work, in the workplace. And some of them were actually good, some were bad, but most of them were kind of cringy. But and in doing so, we were able to then, I would bring in an expert who worked in whatever that field was, and we would talk about it. What does this mean? If your organization isn't going to change, what can you do as an individual so you don't feel helpless? How can you make it better yourself? And each time we would talk about one of those things, it was, let's bring in this expert to help us see what we can do. So you know that there's always something can be done. It's not, oh, it's just the way the world is. I have to resign to it. You can be a victim, which sometimes is just code for a volunteer, right? You allowed that to happen. When there are times when you can make a choice and have an active role in making things better. And I see that the work that you're doing on LinkedIn being in that vein. What can I do instead of just resigning to the fact that this is just the way things are? How can I do something to be a catalyst for change? You may not be the one who changes everyone's mind or anyone's mind, but you start the conversation, and somewhere down the line,
Mm.
something will happen.
Hmm. Absolutely. And what's really interesting, and I agree with everything that you just said. And I love that you had that I love that you gave the opportunity for people to be heard too, because that's another important thing in this space is there's so many silent voices that go unheard. And this is why we keep perpetuating the same nonsense that we go through as a nation. And on LinkedIn, what's really interesting, living in the social media space, I always try to encourage my entrepreneurs to remember, we grew up in this world of social media to understand that followers mean everything,
Mhm.
views mean likes and hearts and reactions are everything. But the reality is that if you really have a message, then it's views over likes. People aren't going to like my content because my content will then pop up on their followers feeds and they don't want to know that John Smith liked my post, but they're reading it. I could look at the analytics and say that I've had 15,000 people look at my post and it only has, no kidding, 8 reactions on it or 17 reactions on it. But it tells me that we're talking about something that's out of the
Mhm.
norm, right? And it tells me that it is opening up conversations and at least people are reading it, and whether they could feel any type of way about it, they're going to constantly see my stuff pop up on their feed unless they completely block me. So, you know, which I'm okay with as well. So uh, it's a very valuable space that we're in, and I think we've been given a very beautiful opportunity to do this. However it looks for any one of us. Like you said earlier, this isn't everybody's battle. This isn't everybody. Not everybody has the mental bandwidth to be able to have this fight, right? I do this day in and day out. I've got the energy. I'm like, bring it to me, buddy. Like I get it, But it also took me years of education and deprogramming from the generational traumas that I was raised with. I mean, I grew up in a very Latino household, but to be completely honest, for my Latino audience who knows, we grew up in a very homophobic, transphobic, masculine household where the man had to do this, very patriarchal. It's toxic, I mean, and it's the norm, right? Of how we grow up. And so I truly believe that it is our responsibility as a newer generation that if we can learn to do better, we do better, right? And so that's how I'm raising my kids, right? And they're woke AF, um, and they keep me in check sometimes, and it's just an everlasting process of growth that I think is it's a beautiful thing. It's difficult, but it's
I
necessary.
mean, it is, but it actually is. I mean, every generation just moves the needle just a little bit more, and after a while, it starts to move a little bit more again, and then again, and you start to see changes. And it's not. I think a lot of people expect overnight. We're gonna do
Of
this, and it's gonna
course.
be perfect, and we're gonna have utopia tomorrow, and that's not the way it works. And so, to your point earlier, it has to be a long game that you're there for the long haul, and knowing that you're building a foundation for something else. You may not even get to see that change that you're trying to impact, but you're building the foundation for it to exist.
I hope
And
so.
so that I mean, I love that. And that's one of the things that makes I think your LinkedIn really particularly refreshing is that it talks about those conversations that we're not supposed to talk about, but in a way that's
Yes.
respectful. It never feels preachy or judgy. It feels like, oh, this is information. And some people are going to take it as preachy or judgy regardless because it says something that they're uncomfortable with. But
Of course.
there's always a note or a tone, respect, and sincerity that I really can appreciate.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a very uncomfortable space, right? So I remind a lot of individuals, whether they're people of color or not, a couple of things, right? Race is a social construct. It was made up. Racism is real, right? The byproduct of a made up concept is real, which is out of this world to think about. But then you also have to remember that whether you're a person of color or you are top 1%, we all were fed horrible education that was misleading, right? About our country's history and the atrocities that we didn't want to talk about. And, growing up in the South's education looked completely different than what it did out west and up north, which I was a part of too. So, you know, when you realize that there's just been this overall disconnect since the very beginning, then it allows you as a creator in this space to have a lot more patience, and it allows you to feel whatever you need to feel, but also not take it out on individuals because you know what's what's really happening in the meat of it all, right? And so I think it helps me formulate my message a lot clearer so it doesn't come out pointing fingers, and because we've all been there and we've all done it and we've all feel it and we all it's a real thing. So I think if we can normalize these conversations to this capacity where it feels more like a peaceful conversation rather than an attack, then I think we can make progress a lot faster.
Agreed. Totally agree. So, changing gears a little bit, you're a creator, and as we all know, creators create things. We've seen your graphic design. We know that you do a lot of amazing social media stuff, but it sounds like recently you've also completed a feature. Let's talk a little bit about that and how that's factoring in, because it sounds like a passion project, but it ties very closely to your work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So right during COVID in 2020, as I was handling clients' businesses online, there was a point where my brother was like, "Hey, we have to be quarantined, or we have to be at home for an extensive period of time." Like, I thought to myself, well, if I'm not able to work, and businesses at this point were closing left to right all around me, right? So small businesses and all that. So I was having a successful chunk of businesses here and then businesses closing down here. And then there was a point where I realized that I was going to be at home for at least a couple of months, at least. And I thought to myself as a creative, yeah, I'm going to go crazy if I don't do something creative. Like, what are you talking about? I have to stay home. And my brother and I, we were living together at the time. We grew up together. And so he's a creative as well, and we were always trying to create either a comic book or a movie growing up. But we didn't have the resources growing up. We were
Hmm.
poor. And so at this point, I had all my music equipment, my cameras, my computer. I knew how to do all the editing. And I sat there one day and I was like, "Hey, do you want to film that movie we always talked about, growing up?" And he was just like, "Yeah, sure." And so I spent 672 hours on writing, directing, scripting, producing, scoring a movie in my apartment. And I went onto Facebook groups and I hired actors from all around the world who just wanted camera time. It was one of the first
Hmm.
COVID movies, if not the first COVID movie, the official COVID movie. It was the first film that was made socially distanced with cameras and characters on my
Hmm.
cell phones. Like, there were a lot of weird things, a lot of weird firsts in the movie. It got nominated through the Vancouver International Film Festival for Best Picture,
Nice.
Best Director. Like, yeah, I mean, but total fluke of a project that I was just like, no, this is a passion project, but I want to make this happen, and it succeeded. It did very well.
And I mean, to be honest, it's something that it was a passion project. You had the time. I mean, COVID gave everybody a lot of free time. And I think it really, again, goes back to that topic of how personal life and business have to coexist. Because you tell a client that, you tell me that, and thinking, wow, this guy's really creative. I wonder if we could work together and do something. If he can come up with this during a pandemic, what kind of really amazing stuff can we do for my social media? Or maybe we can do something similar and document it, or whatever that is.
That's right.
And you didn't do the movie to get rich. It wasn't for a client. You did it because it was something you've always
Right.
wanted to do. And
That's right. And I did it in a $0 budget, I mean, meaning that I didn't spend a single dime to make it happen. I already had everything in the
mhm,
house. So I was like, why not? Like, it's already here. And so, yeah. And I also used the opportunity to put Mod Atlas in the forefront as a media company, as a true media company, to say, I could film a movie if I wanted to. Right. And the purpose behind the message was to show entrepreneurs. The other thing that I try to tell people is that stop worrying about budgets. If it's homegrown, if it's done in a $0 budget, do the best that you can to show your actual skill, to show what you can really do with very, very little, because you can do absolutely anything you put your mind to. And so it was a beautiful experience, to be
I
honest.
love that point. One of my
It was
bosses told me something similar when I was starting my career, and someone was complaining about, we could do this thing, but we don't have enough budget. And she stopped us and said, "Why would I trust you with more money when I can't trust you with no money?"
Oh,
And she said, "You should think about that. Why would I give you more if you can't make do with what you currently have?" And it's very true. If I can be creative and show you my skill when I don't have it, if the budget is the only thing that makes your work good, then your work isn't really good. It's money that's good, not you.
100%. Such a valuable lesson. Yeah, and that was a self-taught lesson that I realized, right? Like, I talk a lot of smack on social media. But I realized that if I'm gonna talk the talk, I better walk that walk, and so it's also been the driving force of like, okay, well, if I'm preaching this, right, and I try not to be preachy, but if I'm saying this to my entrepreneurs and I'm trying to give the guidance, I have to show that I've done
Mhm.
it, right? I can't tell people, "Oh, you could do this and this and this," and then they're gonna be like, "Well, what have you done?" And I'm like, "Well, not much." I never wanted to be in that position. And so everything that I always promote and express and the guidance that I give is truly been done through my experiences. I've seen it,
Mhm.
I've lived it, I've done it. It's possible. And so it's just yeah, you better walk that walk if you're gonna talk a
I
big
mean,
game,
that's totally
no
I
doubt.
my entire career, I've always done that. My mom said I would never ask you to do something like at home or anything like that I wouldn't do myself or I haven't already done. Because if that can, how do I
Mm,
have any leverage? How do I have any ground to stand on if I'm telling you to do something, but I'm not willing to do it? Why should you be? And
mm,
I took that when I went to work, and that's how we run our company now. That's why we have a production arm because so many times we're talking to creatives and they're, oh, you don't understand. You're just doing a data thing or you're just doing blah, blah, blah. Well, actually, no, we've actually done it here. And so now you're speaking the same language and you built credibility and you're actually doing the things that you said you can do versus theoretically, I'm telling you about it, but we don't really know if I could do it.
right. Yeah. It doesn't fly
Yeah.
with me.
So
Mhm.
with that, let's tell people where they could find you, how they can learn more about Mod Atlas, how they can contact you if they're interested in working with you and growing their social, or even just coming up with some really great ideas to build out a brand.
Yeah, absolutely. So where you can find me the best, I am all over social media. So what I go by today is the real Christian Ortiz on TikTok and Instagram. Modest Roots, my band moniker on Twitter. Um, Facebook is just Christian Ortiz, also Christian Ortiz Modest Roots. I'm all over Facebook as well and all of my projects. But Instagram, I'm on there 24/7 for sure. So if anybody wants to take a look at kind of how I've laid out my brick on there too, it's a perfect example. Shifting that into your next question about how, maybe how do we build a brand? Um, every social media platform that you have is a different audience. They all speak differently. There's always going to be a specific group that's on TikTok more than Instagram, some that are on Instagram more than Facebook, vice versa. LinkedIn is all professionals, people who are just trying to branch out a little bit on LinkedIn. I see this like fluctuating audience in LinkedIn that's trying to branch out more. So the key, I think, is self-reflection, identifying what your mission and purpose is, what your message is, and then learn how to communicate that message on every social media platform.
Hmm.
For my Instagram, and if you remember this, Instagram is all about the visual brand, right? It's a picture app, so that has to encompass your visual concepts. Your TikTok is your personality and your passion.
Hmm.
Your LinkedIn is the professional side of you, and Facebook is your neighbors, right? The people next to you. So if you can remember how to break those up and how to speak to every one of those individuals, then you have the recipe to build something massive and pretty quickly. So yeah. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to me anytime.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Christian, for being on. I'm looking forward to many more conversations. I'm really excited you were so open to joining the podcast and can't wait to see what's
Absolutely.
next.
Thank you so much, Damien. I appreciate it.